Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Patrick Spiro, and I'm the librarian of the American Philosophical Society, the full title of which is the American Philosophical Society held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge. And even though the full name of our organization says held at Philadelphia, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the American Philosophical Society resides on Lenape-Hoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Today, I'm thrilled to invite an old friend, James McClure, to talk about an exciting new digital project he's organizing as the general editor of the Thomas Jefferson Papers. It's a project that is aiming to digitize Jefferson's historic weather data and is increasingly expanding its scope to include other archives and other repositories. And he's in the process of developing a highly innovative and interactive website that is going to be extremely useful to scholars, to historians, and to scientists alike. And so I'm thrilled in a few moments to welcome Jim and to talk a little bit more about this project. Now, as a little bit of background, I received Jim's formal biography that you can find on the web. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about how I've gotten to know Jim through the years. I first met Jim actually through a scholarship. I had no idea who James McClure was, but I was researching the history of Pittsburgh during the American Revolution, and I came across his work, The Ends of the American Earth, which is a remarkable and deeply researched study of the area around Pittsburgh during the era of the American Revolution in the 18th century. And I was blown away by this research. And then soon enough, as I advanced in my career and moved on to the David Library of the American Revolution, I met Jim, who was then the associate editor of the Thomas Jefferson Papers, and invited him to give a teacher workshop that looked at Thomas Jefferson and science as a way to build out curriculum that explored the history of science in the age of Thomas Jefferson. And during that workshop, Jim shared with us one of the remarkable finds he's made in the Jefferson Papers. Jim found on the back of a letter some mathematical calculations that many people might have just dismissed as unimportant, just Jefferson making some notes on the back of a letter. But Jim, I won't share too much, but Jim was able to figure out what this meant, and it had real significance in Jefferson's history. And you can check out the Jefferson Papers, and Jim might want to say a few words about what he found later on during the Q&A. But it was an incredible find, and Jim now has been promoted to the general editor of the Jefferson Papers. He's had a distinguished career in the world of scholarly editing, most recently serving as president of the Association for Documentary Editing. So it's wonderful to welcome Jim. I'm sure people by now are very familiar with the Zoom format, but we are using the Zoom webinar format. Jim's going to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes about this project, and then we're going to open up the floor to Q&A. To ask questions, please use the chat box, the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. And we will be, Byron Miller, the head of our Center for Digital Scholarship, who's been working with Jim on this project, will be fielding questions and asking Jim them for you. We also have closed captioning. You can see that option again on the bottom right of your Zoom panel. And without any further ado, I want to turn things over to Jim and hear about this incredible project that he's launched.
Okay, well, thank you, Pat. After that introduction, I'm not sure I need to do anything. I could just quit and go home. But let's go on. I appreciate it. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so we're going to talk today about the digitization of Jefferson's weather records, or as we designate them, and as I'll talk about a little later in just a bit, weather and climate records. We start off thinking it was just weather records, but it's got a lot to do with climate also. So we will, we've embarked on this project from the Jefferson Papers at Princeton, in conjunction with some people in Virginia, and where it's a very exciting and a somewhat different kind of project for us, because we generally work on our real task is to publish Jefferson's papers in book form. The volume's behind me, as it happens. And we were aware of Jefferson's weather records for a long time, but they weren't going to go into the mainstream of our volumes. They would have gone into, and may still go into, what we call a second series volume. But I was in no rush to initiate that. Now, the first question may be, this is the homepage of our site that went up in November. The first question may be, why is it the Jefferson Weather and Climate Records and not Thomas Jefferson's Weather and Climate Records? That's a deliberate attempt to sort of pull the emphasis away from Jefferson himself. Now, the manuscripts we're dealing with are part of his records, and he did create most of them himself. But, you know, a lot of people don't care for Jefferson at all. Actually, I have no problem with that. But what I don't want, what I think would be too bad, is for anyone to dismiss these records because of that. It's important to remember that the records actually include some observations, weather observations by some other people. They also include even the records that Jefferson created required a lot of other people to make them happen. He used instruments that were made by skilled craftspeople. He didn't make them himself. And the education that he had, his ability to make these observations, the time he could devote to it, the time he could spend reading and corresponding with others about it, all of that was made possible by other people, most of them his enslaved workers. And so it's Jefferson, but in a way he's just the delivery system. And basically the way I say this is that you don't need to buy into Jefferson in order to put these records to use, to do something with them. That's true really of all of Jefferson's records. Remember also that everything you see in the weather records, in Jefferson's weather records, that weather was affecting lots of other people also. So he may have been the recorder, but he certainly didn't own the climate. So with that, let's begin. And I can think of no better way to begin than with ice cream. And we'll just do our ice cream up front in a virtual way. Now, contrary to what some people believe, Jefferson was not the first to bring the magic of ice cream to America. What he did do was write down this recipe and process for making ice cream that he had learned in France. And perhaps it's the earliest ice cream recipe in America. So this looks very elaborate with lots of steps. However, anyone who has made ice cream the old-fashioned way will know that this is really, the recipe itself is very simple. It's cream and eggs and sugar. And you prepare that and you get it ready. And then the rest of this is mainly a lot of steps involving salt and ice. And the word ice appears at least 10 times in this document. So, question, where does the ice come from? So looking at this map from the period, the circle is Monticello, Jefferson's home near Charlottesville, Virginia. The square is Washington, D.C. The polygon is Philadelphia. In all of those places, we either know or can be fairly certain that Jefferson served ice cream to his guests. But particularly down in Virginia at Monticello, where are they getting the ice to make ice cream? Now, there is an ice house, as you may know, there's an ice house at Monticello. It's basically a subterranean vault where they could pack in a lot of ice and snow, and it would last, because it kept cool, it could last for much of the year. Now, those of us in the 21st century might assume that, well, that ice has to be coming from somewhere well to the north. They must be cutting it out in blocks, packing it up in straw, and then transporting it down along the coast and somehow getting it up to Virginia. And what hasn't melted by then could go into this ice house. But that is not the case. The ice for Monticello's ice house was harvested on site. It was harvested there at Monticello, which would not happen now. I mean, you can't really harvest a lot of ice in that part of Virginia now in the 21st century. So welcome to what is often called the Little Ice Age. Jefferson's period was a part of a long cooling period in the history of climate. And it's interesting, it makes weather records from that period important for a couple of reasons. One is to improve the understanding of that transition from the Little Ice Age to industrialization and human-caused changes to the climate in the 19th century. There are pretty good weather records beginning about the middle of the 19th century, the middle decades, the 19th century, depending on the place, like from about 1830s to 1870s. But there aren't as many records, particularly done by careful observers working systematically over a long period of time with instruments from before that, from Jefferson's period. Now, another reason for us to look at these records and deal with these records is to understand the effects of climate and the environment on people at the time. What was it like for them to live in that colder environment, that colder climate than we are used to? So there's a couple of good reasons for looking at weather records and using weather records. Now, Jefferson's papers relating to weather contain a variety of manuscripts, and we're working to get as much of that as possible up on this website. But the most important part, the real core of it, consists of about 142, 144 pages of these daily observation records, these tables. They began in July 1776, when Jefferson was attending the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. And they had a few things going on, as you may recall, but they begin July 1st, 1776, in terms of the surviving record, what we have. And they go until late June, 1826, just really a few days before Jefferson died. Much of the time he made 2 observations a day. This page, this double page spread you see here is early on, and he may be doing more than 2 a day. I'm not certain about that. But when he really got in the groove and he was really going with this, he would make 2 observations a day, one at sunrise to catch the low temperature, and one about at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, depending on the season, depending on the time of year, to get the high temperature. That was fairly typical. Lots of people who collected weather records, who made weather records, collected this information, did something like that. Now, for this record of Jefferson's, there are some gaps, there's some significant gaps, some of them running for several years duration. Some of the gaps are because he stopped keeping the record for a while, and then he would come back. Some of the gaps are because some of the pages have gone astray for one reason or another since his time. Now, the observation record, all of these pages, when I talk about, about 140 pages, they're in pieces in the collections of 5 institutions. It's the Massachusetts Historical Society, Library of Congress, They have the most of it. Those two institutions have the most of it, just as they have most of Jefferson's papers in general. The New York Public Library has a few pages of the weather record, and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and the New York Historical Society each have one leaf of the record with tables on front and back. In the 1660s, the English scientist Robert Hooke established a method, or laid down a method, for keeping these kinds of weather records, these tabular weather records of the sort that Jefferson kept. And so there are columns, vertical columns that have categories of information, and then there are horizontal rows, you know, a row for each day or each part of a day. And Hooke's method also depended on, expected the observer to have instruments, to be using things like a thermometer and a barometer. This laid down this kind of tabular method that Jefferson followed. Jefferson probably learned about keeping a weather record when he was a student at the College of William and Mary, both in his classes at the college and as part of a circle that he became involved with that included some educated people there in Williamsburg, including even the colonial governor of Virginia. And those people were interested in, among other things, they would have what amounted to sort of intellectual salons. It's kind of an intellectual circle, but they were also interested in recording the weather and making weather observations. So Jefferson would have been introduced at the time when he was coming into his intellectual life. He would have been introduced to this. But the question arises as to why was he doing it? Why did he keep this record? For Jefferson, contrary to what you may think, Jefferson did not get involved with everything. He did not, I mean, yes, he was a polymath, but if he kept a weather record like this over the course of half a century, there was a reason for it. And it's difficult to know in this case exactly what the reason was. You don't find in his records, in his other papers, a lot of evidence of him using this record, at least in terms of weather. You don't see him, he seems not to have actually been interested in short-term weather that much. Now, he may have been drawing on this. He may have been using these records for, you know, to help him with his, you know, the agriculture on his plantations, or for whatever reason, but we don't see a lot of evidence of that. We don't pick up where you can see in other papers that he's doing that. What he does seem to be interested in, what seemed to have been of a real focus for him, was actually climate. And that's the word he would use. He would sometimes write to someone and say, if you have a thermometer and you can keep track of the weather where you are and do it as a daily record, a detailed record, I will do it where I am, and we can start looking at differences in climate. And these would be differences, you know, could you tell a difference between at Monticello, which is up on a little mountain in near Charlottesville, Jefferson's weather there, and what was happening down lower elevation in the tidewater of Virginia, differences within Virginia, differences between Virginia and, say, Philadelphia. And what you would need would be to have observers working both places. Differences also between North America and Europe, say, to know, again, to understand about the climate. And he always used the word climate. He says, this is so we can learn about the climate. This seems to have been part of his interest in learning about building a foundation of information about North America. And in fact, in Notes on the State of Virginia, when he was presented one of the questions. This is Notes on the State of Virginia, is a set of responses to a series of questions. And one of the questions asked about everything that can increase the progress of human knowledge. It's a pretty open-ended question, but Jefferson really just focused on one topic. He says, under the latitude of this query, I will presume it not improper nor unacceptable to furnish some data for estimating the climate of Virginia. And then that chapter is just about climate. That was his interest. So in 2018, I had been approached by people a couple of times saying, are you going to do something with the weather records? And for a long time, we would say, no, we're not going to, because we were thinking it would just be published in a volume and there would be like pages of numbers. It would be difficult for somebody to get much out of that. And we also didn't really have the time, didn't want to devote the time to work on that. But then by 2018, I decided that, well, now really was the time. Something needed to be done with this record. But I knew also we had just enough experience with digital projects. We knew that this could be done as a digital project. We could start it off as a digital project, rather than thinking it would have to be a book first and then could become a digital project. So we had done a bit of work. We don't, here at the Jefferson Papers in Princeton, we don't have the expertise to be able to do what it would take to create this digital resource. But we had done some work with the Center for Digital Editing at the University of Virginia. It's headed by Jennifer Sturzer. And we were familiar with their team, and we approached them and asked if they would be interested in collaborating on this project with us. Because they do have the expertise to do this, but they're also very familiar with the content of these kinds of documents. And they're really interested in the challenges of how you take different kinds of documents and turn them into something useful in a digital environment. They really got their beginning as part of the Papers of George Washington project and working with Washington's financial papers. So there again, you have papers that were not what we would call non-epistolary. They're not letters. They're not standard textual documents. They have a lot of numbers. They have a lot of data, a lot of numerical information that you would that you could put to use. You could do something with in a truly digital environment. So we embarked on this as a collaborative project so that some members of the Jefferson Papers staff, and then the group of 3 you see here from the Center for Digital Editing, would collaborate on this. And we here in Princeton would concentrate really on the content and preparing the content. And they in Charlottesville would work on designing the digital resource and then making it all happen. We've been fortunate also to be able to get some funding from the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, the NHPRC, which is affiliated with the National Archives and Records Administration. And we have been able to piggyback this sort of side project along with other funding we get from the NHPRC. And that has been very helpful in terms of making this possible to really go ahead with this. In addition to the core team you see here, if you visit our website and you look at the acknowledgements page, you'll see some other people named there also, and we will be, we will add names as certainly as other people may be involved with the project. But this is the core group that made it all happen. We also, at this initial point, at the same time we were setting up that collaboration, we got in contact with the APS and the digital group there that Bayard Miller heads, to ask if they were interested in doing anything with their weather records that are in the collections of the APS. And as it turns out, quite fortuitously, they were just on the verge of doing that, of starting to digitize their weather records. And I knew there was a very rich collection of weather records at the APS because in my years in the Jefferson papers, I'd seen some of these things pass through Jefferson's hands to get to the APS. People would send him things, papers on different subjects, including things like weather records, and he would pass them along because much of the time he was president of the United States, he was also president of the APS. And so he had an affiliation with the APS for years and years, and people would send him things, he would send them to the APS, and I knew that they had these weather records. And the really great part about opening this conversation with the APS is that, like our group, they were using Drupal, which is a content management system, to digitize their records and to do things with them. And like us, they were committed to free open access to the results. We take this data, we go to the work to digitize it and to make it available, and then we just put it up and make it available to anybody who wants it. There's no paywall here. And we were committed to that from the beginning, and the APS was committed to that with their records also. And the reason this was so important, that they were using some of the same technology and they were committed to the same basis that we were, is that from the beginning, we were all interested in trying to perhaps build something as then a next step that would mesh together the Jefferson record, various records from the APS, and any other North American weather records from before the mid-19th century that either will be digitized or could be digitized. That there would be, can we construct a single site that would work as a portal that people can come to and can not only identify and be routed to various digital projects, but that we could actually have compatibility of the data sets, and there could be searching across a number of these digital projects from one site. And that's the big goal. So once we had the team in place, our collaboration in place, and we had this collaboration with the APS beginning, we were really ready to go. And so now I can talk a little about what that involves. We encountered along the way some interesting challenges with Jefferson's papers. The APS team, I know, has encountered challenges with the records they're dealing with also. And the way we have met some of those challenges should be instructive for us, should be helpful as we then try to go for a larger endeavor of pulling together different sites. Because one of the things about these records from before the mid-19th century is they're all handwritten, they're all going to be somewhat idiosyncratic and have their own anomalies. And if we can figure out now how to deal with those kinds of things, it will help us when we then go on to deal with a larger collection. So here's a sampling of 8 pages of Jefferson's daily observation record. And from a high enough altitude, they look very much the same. There's a structural similarity you can see in the tabular structure. If you get down closer to ground level, there's actually a lot of differences. And this is just a grab bag of different pieces of Jefferson's record. But you see, sometimes there's column headings, sometimes not. In different periods, he's using different instruments. Not every entry has a temperature reading. recorded, but most of them do. Temperature and just sort of general weather conditions he would tend to do. But there's times when he's using hygrometers. There's times when he's using a barometer. There's times when he may be using apparently some sort of device for measuring wind force. He tended not to record precipitation regularly, but he sometimes, if you look sort of almost in the middle, a little above the center of the slide here, that 0.5076, that's actually a precipitation amount. And yes, before you all hit the chat in the Q&A, we're perfectly aware that he could not have had a gauge that would measure to 10,000ths of an inch of rain. That's actually a calculated amount. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A as to how he came up with that amount. However, he doesn't tend to really record precipitation as a regular thing. He did not put columns always in the same order, going left to right. Now, if we were doing this, if we were going to do a print publication of this in one of our volumes, we would follow this, his structure pretty religiously. We would try to replicate his headings. As we went, we would try to do a duplication of his format. That we're not doing that for a digital endeavor. And the reason we're not doing that is this information needs to be used as data. These entries need to be able to be torn apart and reconfigured and used, the information in them used different ways. Now, an additional problem with Jefferson's weather record is he tended with barometer readings to omit digits to the left of the decimal point if the number didn't change from directly above. So if you look at that left-hand column, it's 29.32. That next one down is 29.34. So if you're going to do that, if you're going to record exactly what he typed, what he wrote, if you're going to put that in your transcription, and it's just going to be 0.34, that's not useful information for somebody who really wants to use the barometric pressure information. And then he did the same thing for abbreviations of weather conditions. He would tend to have a column, and he would just put F for fair, C for cloudy. CAR doesn't mean car, it means cloudy after rain. FAR means fair after rain. So again, if we transcribe those literally as documentary editors, is that information going to be useful to people using the edition? So to solve these problems, to solve these challenges, meet these challenges, one thing we did is pile a lot of specific information into a document description of each piece of the manuscript. And it's there where we talk about things like column headings. If he used column headings for that in that series of pages, then we say so there, because we couldn't really attach column headings to each entry. We also did a kind of double entry of information. So within our data set, for many categories of information, there's a transcription field, and then there's a data field. So for example, for barometer, if he put 0.97, if that's what's in the record, in the transcription field, it appears as 0.97. In the data field, it's 28.97. And then for his weather conditions, we actually used a list of what those abbreviations meant, and then put those values in a data field. So this allows us to produce a kind of what we call a transcription view. And so if you look up in that top row for January 1, 1796, coming across, we have the weather condition as F, and the barometer is 29.17. If you come down a couple of rows, the barometer reading is 0.33. This transcription view is a literal transcription of what he wrote in the manuscript. However, we can't do the columns in the order he always did. We have to do a structured ordering of our columns. But what we figured out, this took a lot of discussion as to how this would work, how this would function, but we can put an image of the page with each one of, when you see this transcription view, you can view the image of the page. So if someone is really interested to see how this thing looked as a manuscript, you can compare the transcription with that. Over on the right-hand side of each row where it says view data, if you click on that, you will get the entry in a different form. What you will get there is the data fields. So in this case, if he abbreviated the barometric reading and just gave the digits after the decimal point, you'll get the whole thing. You can get usable barometric pressure data there. We gave the team down at the CDE actually gave this view a different look. If you notice, it has a completely different look from the transcription view, so that it sort of telegraphs when you're looking at the data view, which is a more modern look, and when you're looking at transcription view. And also, as you can see at the bottom of the slide here, it's possible to go back and forth. You can, if you're at the data view for some reason, you can go to the transcription view if that's what you want to see, or you can see it there. By doing these data fields, it also let us build search capabilities. And these, I've had to split this up into several boxes to run across the page. This actually all runs down the left side of the search page. There are lots of possibilities here for different faceted searches. And you can click on, when you click on one of those, it'll open up and you can see what's below it, and you can keep channeling all the way down. And you can do you can apply multiple limitations on the search. And it is also possible, if you go to that search page, at the bottom of the page, there's a button where you can download a structured file. If you have not put in any limitations on the search, you'll get everything, which is currently something like 20,000 rows. If you have put limitations on, then you will get the results of that search that you called for. The team in Charlottesville was also able to create this kind of entry into the weather conditions data because we made a data field for those weather conditions. You can go to this page on our site, click on one of these buttons, and see all of the entries that have that condition. And this is important also because there are times when Jefferson put something about weather conditions into just a notations field. He didn't put it in his column with his weather conditions. An example is if he gave, indicated something about either a river freezing or thawing. And that's what these are. We've clumped them together into a category that we've labeled ice in rivers. But if he said that in a notation, we wanted to come up with a way to pull that information out and make it accessible by way of this kind of like data access. For example, this top entry here, the one for December 16th, 1802, it's ice in rivers. What he actually says in his notation is river impassable. And this, he's at Washington, so that would be the Potomac River. At 9 o'clock in the night, the thermometer was 10 degrees. The river frozen solidly over this morning nearly to Alexandria. This is something that we would anticipate we're going to see in other kinds of weather diaries from other sources. You're going to get situations in which someone writes a prose, more diary-like kind of entry but there's hard data in it. And so this was sort of an experiment for how to do that. That in this case, if he mentions something about, if the record mentions something about freezing or thawing of a river, we could tag it so that it could be retrieved in this search. Similarly, in his notations, Jefferson would sometimes put down information about seasonal activity, what's known in science as phenology, which is sort of the ecological relationship of living things and seasons, the changes in the seasons. And for Jefferson, it could involve, when did he first hear frogs? When did he have peas at the table? We have again, in this case, we've got a data field for this so that we can, for example, the fourth one down where he says yuckers here, yuckers means the bird flickers, northern flickers. And so we can tag that, and basically there's a way you can go and just click on a button and find out some more information about the flicker and see all the entries for the northern flicker. And in addition, it would be nice if I could do this as a real-time thing where you could actually see the interaction of this, the interactivity of it. But for birds and plants and for some other things, the center in Charlottesville has created these interactive data visualizations that if you go to these charts and actually like hover the cursor, you'll get more information. And you can do limitations to only see some of these things at a time. Finally, we've got other kinds of records in Jefferson's weather papers. And they're records that don't fit the category, that don't fit the format of daily observation records. So we couldn't really make them as part of that same data set. What would we do with them? So, excuse me, we're adding those to the site as we go, and really in the form of standalone transcriptions. But it raises some important questions, because again, we're going to be encountering we expect to encounter this kind of variety of documents. How do we deal with documents that are not daily observation records? How do we make them discoverable when they're digitized and they're up on the site? For example, Jefferson's recapitulation of depth of snows. This is really, it's showing you annual amounts of snow. So we've done this as a standalone transcription, but we're thinking about, we need to work on ways to be able to incorporate monthly summaries, annual summaries in with those daily records and make these kinds of things accessible. Whether that would be done, whether these things would be in a separate data set or could be incorporated into the main data set, we've yet to really solve that. So I'll just end with this slide again, because I want to emphasize really the importance of teamwork and collaboration in making this happen. This is just not the sort of project that one individual can do. It takes a lot of discussion, a lot of throwing of ideas in and sort of back and forth, just talk and consideration of possibilities. And so it's absolutely vital. And so I always want to stress both the collaboration of this team, but also our conversations and our collaboration now with the APS on these larger endeavors. So I will end with that, and we can go to Bayard and Q&A.
Great. Let me change my view here. Thanks, Jim. That was great. I love every time I talk to you and hear more about your project, I get just more and more excited about our upcoming joint venture. It's all very exciting. I want to start us off selfishly, I guess, because it pertains to how I create our data sets. But you mentioned the problematic way in which Jefferson, calculated barometric pressure. Can you speak a little bit more about that?
What he would do is he basically just made a shortcut. When he was going to write down the barometric pressure, if it's 29.38 and the one directly above it was 29.22, he would, for that second one, the one coming down, he would just omit the 2.9 and just put what was to the right of the decimal point. It works. It's perfectly understandable when you see it in context on that page. But if you take that entry and remove it and reconfigure it or put it in some other context as a result of a search, you don't know what those first two digits would have been. So we had a lot of discussion as to how we were going to handle that. Do you have some sort of like sexy little cursor hover thing that something would pop up? And what we finally came upon was we just needed to do this kind of double entry. We would do what he did literally, and we could show that in one view, and then we would do the data in manipulable good form, standardized form that more people would find useful in another field. And we had to do that with certain fields of information.
Great. I have a question here about other collections. So are there many other contemporary collections of weather data that has survived? Why or why not is this historic data preserved? I know here at the APS, we have a great collection, which you mentioned earlier, and I'm discovering new things every day. We have James Madison's, David Rittenhouse, Pemberton, Bartram stuff, among many others. Have you found others in other institutions throughout our area?
Yeah, we've started lining them up just to see what the universe is that might be involved. There's a total of, it's dozens. I don't have an exact number to give you, but there's dozens. There are a lot of people in New England who are keeping these kinds of records. Now, the records are going to differ. We're aware that some of them are going to be more like diaries and will have some numerical information embedded in them. Some of them may be tables like Jefferson's or Madison's or Rittenhouse's. Others of them may consist primarily of things like of either monthly summaries or annual summaries. And that's one reason why we need to figure out how we're going to deal with those. There's a lot of them. There's not a lot of digitization of them so far. There have been digitization projects for certain weather records, global, not American so much, but starting by about the mid-19th century on. Some of those are being digitized, but the American ones, the earlier ones, are not really being digitized. I should mention also that Joyce Chaplin on the faculty at Harvard is in the middle of a big project, or perhaps towards the end of a big project, to build a database of weather information that people wrote into almanacs. And so there's another sort of aspect or challenge, is how do you take information that's in an almanac and extract that and make that useful for people. But the answer is there's a fair number of these things out there still in manuscript form.
Great, many and growing. Let's see. So have you been in communication with current climate scientists to work on formats that will enable them to advantage all Jefferson's records? Yes,
we started that early on to get some idea as to what we need to do to structure it. We've learned along the way that a lot of climate history researchers currently, what's useful for them, at least for some of the analysis, is if they can have barometric pressure readings along with temperatures, because they can use they can use those to sort of improve the data and understand better what's happening with the temperatures. In Jefferson's case, there's only a couple of thousand entries that have barometric pressure. He actually did not do that for a long period of time. Now, in the case of hygrometers, there are, I don't know the number, but there's a fair number of hygrometer readings recorded in the record. And the difficulty with hygrometers is hygrometers, the key element to a hygrometer, at least most of the hygrometers of that time, the ones that Jefferson was using, the key component was a human hair or an animal hair, or maybe a little filament of whale baleen. And so basically what was being measured was the change in length, the minute change in length of a human hair. Well, those things just, they couldn't really be calibrated so that one person's readings would match what another person's hygrometer would have been showing over in the next county. So in the case of hygrometers, we consulted with some people and decided that, well, we're going to go ahead and transcribe those, but we're not going to have a data field for them because nobody can really do much with that. But the answer is yes, we've tried to be in consultation with them. And we know that there have been some instances of them taking our data, downloading our structured file of our data to put it to use.
Excellent, thanks. Could you say something about how common these kinds of systematic longitudinal weather climate records were in 18th and early 19th century North America?
Actually, you may be able to answer that a little better than I can because I've mainly dealt with Jefferson's. Maybe you can say a little bit about like the Madison and the Rittenhouse. I know the APS has one that's a set of records collected by William Dunbar down on the lower Mississippi River in the very late 18th century that consists of, I believe, temperature readings over the course of a year, but I can't remember, it may be like monthly summaries, a monthly average through the course of a year. But there was an interest in doing these sort of longer term kinds of things, but maybe you can help us with Madison and Rittenhouse.
Yeah, well, Madison is very, very similar to Jefferson. Like, I mean, the structure is near identical, the time frame is near identical. Rittenhouse, what's interesting about Rittenhouse is his lunar calculations that he has as well. But those are, I'm still very early on in this, so those are the two that I've really spent the most time with. But you're right about the Dunbar, and I think that is monthly summaries. But yeah, so stay tuned, I guess, for a deeper answer to that. So here's a good one. Can we think about Jefferson's motives behind this project and how he kept up with meteorological research in his time by going through his library, the books he owned, his marginalia, if any? For instance, did he own copies of Louis Coates' treatise on meteorology, Deluc's writings on hygrometers, the Palatine Society's ephemerides, etc.? Did he present his observations to the Royal Society or other organizations?
In terms of the books he looked at, he had quite a library. I would have to go look that up. He was certainly familiar with Deluc's hygrometers because there's a time when he's using the Deluc as one of his hygrometers. But so far, we have not found a good straight line from Jefferson to this knowledge base. So we're not entirely sure what's going on, why he's, where he's coming from with all of it. We know he's reading some things. He's probably reading some things. He would have acquired a good bit of information at William and Mary because the professor he studied under there for natural science, I think really took Jefferson's quantification skills to another level. And so he surely was familiar with a lot of that, but I haven't seen a lot of evidence so far that really helps explain it. To draw a comparison here, again, as you know, because these papers ended up at the APS, Jefferson had another long-term kinds of project that had to do with collection of vocabularies in Native American languages. And in that case, he had a definite goal. He had a reason for doing it, because he would say to people, and we can see this in the correspondence, he would say that, you know, if the Russian Empire, if those scientists can get some information about languages of Siberia, and we can compare those with languages of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, maybe we can figure out if there is a connection, that that's where Native peoples of America came from. So there there's really a hypothesis that's being worked on. I'm not certain of what the hypothesis would have been in terms of climate. He did have, I mean, there's this long running dispute he had with the Comte de Buffon, very famously, that Jefferson felt that Buffon had not, you know, had not given America its due. And this continues even after Buffon's, like, you know, dead and gone. There's probably an element of that he wants to really sort of establish what the American climate is like. He would often write to people or say to people that the climate at Monticello was perfect, that this was like the perfect place. This is perfect, you know, perfect weather, perfect climate. So perhaps it was all about trying to establish that. I don't know.
Yeah. So would you say he definitely had an axe to grind with the Comte de Buffon?
He certainly did in that case, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. I think we have time for about one more. I'm going to go with sort of a fun one here. Have you made the ice cream in the recipe that you found in the Jefferson papers?
I have not. No. You know, nor have I. He also wrote out this long process. It took him a day to learn it. When he was in northern Italy, he worked out. He learned the process and wrote down the process to make Parmesan cheese. I've not tried to follow that through either. Oh, I should say, as sort of like you know, just a counterpoint to ice cream. Since there's phenological data in the records, I'll just let people know that the weather records don't include the years 1783, 1800, or 1817. And why would that be significant? Well, those would have been years when brood 10, brood X of the 17-year cycle cicadas would have emerged. But we don't have anything from Jefferson's weather records about that. And actually, I was surprised to learn, if you go looking in the founding era papers and try to find anything about cicadas, or if you search for locusts, which they may have called them also, they don't seem to, these insects don't seem to have made much impression on that generation. But you know, so we got ice cream today, but we didn't get cicadas. That's my gift.
All right. That seems like a good place to end. I want to thank Jim for doing this presentation today, and everybody for coming out. Please take a look at Jim's site, take a look at our site. This project's going to be really gearing up in the next couple of years, and we're all pretty excited. So thanks, Jim. Thanks for doing this. Thanks everybody for coming out today, and we'll see you all on the next time.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you got it. Yeah.